Now we have your complete guide to gut health. Dr. Hazel Wallace, founder of WellWorks, Raewyn Guerrero, and psychologist Kimberly Wilson tell us everything we need to know about feeding our second brain.
Did you know that around 80% of serotonin, a key neurotransmitter responsible for good mood and energy, is actually produced in your gut? I'm Dr. Ruediger. I'm an integrative doctor and mental health specialist out of Los Angeles. Today, I am talking with experts sharing practical tips for how to nourish your gut to keep your body and mind healthy. I'm here with Kimberly Wilson, who is a chartered psychologist specializing in whole body mental health. She is the author of How to Build a Healthy Brain and former finalist of the Great British Bake Off, keeping us all happy during the pandemic. Thank you. Dr. Hazel Wallace is an NHS medical doctor, registered nutritionist, and best-selling author of The Food Medic, with a podcast and educational platform by the same name. And we have Raewyn Guerrero, who is a functional medicine health coach and founder of WellWorks, a virtual functional medicine practice integrating personalized nutrition with CBT and meditation. So thank you for being here today. I'll start with Kim. I'm going to ask the question, if others would like to chime in too. What have you seen in your practice or maybe experienced firsthand that led you to focus on gut-brain health?
A couple of things, actually. So one of the big things is having an understanding of the impact of nutrition in general on brain health. And I started my career working in prison. And there's quite an established literature, clinical literature, randomized controlled trials showing that improving nutrition in prisons reduces incidence of violence by 30%, which is an incredible amount when you consider how violent prisons can be, how dangerous they can be in terms of not just acts of harm against other people, but self-harm and suicide, which certainly in UK prisons is at an all-time high at the moment. So I was from there thinking about this relationship between the things that we eat and the way that our brains work. And then on the kind of other side of that equation, I work with a lot of people who somatize, so whose psychological experiences are expressed through physical symptoms. And I was really interested. I mean, one of the things about somatic illness is that often people aren't taken very seriously, or they can't almost take their own experience very seriously. And so I was very interested in understanding the underlying mechanics so that I could say to my clients and patients, this is what's happening. This is real. You're not making it up. This isn't, all in your head. This is what your body is doing to express and make sense of your psychological pain. So it was kind of bringing those two things together for me.
That's incredible. And I know that I've, talked to so many patients who have been told, oh, it's all in your head. And it can be so empowering just to have that educational, information to be able to actually validate their own experience. And I wonder if you've seen folks experience improvements just by having that validation.
Yeah, because broadly with somatic experiences, we think the underlying mechanism is stress. And one of the things about feeling as if you're not being taken seriously, or feeling as if you might be making it up and worrying that, sometimes people think, am I going crazy? Is that that's enormously stressful. So having someone listen to you, having someone take you seriously, and then having someone explain, this is what we think is happening for you, and this is how we can see the biomarkers for it, and this is how it makes sense, can relieve, if not the symptoms, but at least some of the stress that they might be experiencing associated to those symptoms.
Yeah. And so then on that meta level, just identifying the connection between gut and brain health can be therapeutic.
Enormous. And particularly for IBS, which is a big issue and really common, and the relationship between those two. But I'll stop now.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hazel, I wonder if you can speak to, how much, because for some listening, they may think, is there really a gut-brain connection? What does that mean? How much can the gut really influence our mental and physical well-being?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are familiar with the phrase the gut-brain connection or the gut-brain axis, but not everyone is aware of how that manifests or what that really means on a basic level. And so we actually refer to the gut as the second brain often. And there's a couple of reasons for this. So the gut and the brain are connected through a long nerve called the vagus nerve, but they're connected in other ways via chemicals called neurotransmitters, and also by the gut microbiome or microbiota, which is this large environment of gut microorganisms in our gut, essentially. And they don't just act locally, they produce different chemicals which have far-reaching effects into different organs, including our brain. And so they can influence our mood. But it goes both ways. So also what goes on in our head can also influence what goes in our gut. And I think the best way of explaining this is when we feel really nervous or excited for something. And although that is a feeling that is happening at our kind of in our minds, it's manifesting in our stomach. So we might feel like we've got butterflies, or we might get some digestive symptoms like diarrhea if we're really nervous or something. And that is essentially the gut-brain axis working in real time.
Yeah. And so I wonder, Raewyn, if you can also speak to, what are some of the determinants that you look for to assess the health of a person's gut-brain connection? Hazel was speaking to that, psycho-emotional connection that we experience with butterflies in our stomach, and that irritable bowel syndrome, which is so prevalent, actually has anxiety as a criterion, or one of the criteria. And so I wonder what other things you look for.
Okay, so this is actually a topic that's so near and dear and personal to me, because I have had IBS and anxiety, so they are comorbid, and I struggled with them for several years, going through the NHS and gastroenterologist. And one of the things that really helped me was when I went and found a functional medicine practitioner, and we screened using something called a GI map. Now, that obviously we correlated with the foods that I was eating and the lifestyle factors that I've been going through. It caused me to retrain in functional medicine as a result, because I was so passionate about what I'd found after sort of being poked and prodded by several other doctors and different types of tests, and them not finding anything and telling me that it was all in my head. And I had trained as a hypnotherapist as well to help with my IBS and to help other people with their IBS, but I wasn't getting any joy or moving the needle forward, even though I had changed my diet and lots of different things. So I guess one of the first things that I like using is a gut health test, but a very specific one called a GI map. And getting a client to keep a photo food diary for about a week really helps as well. So I kind of have these two measures. So I look, obviously there's an intake process where we get them to fill out a lifestyle questionnaire, and we can hear in the client's own words what their symptoms are. And then we look at the food, what they've been consuming, and then we use the lab work to help us make sense and paint a really clear picture of what's going on. So those would be my sort of like three determinants to assess what's going on. But obviously you've got to correlate the symptoms along with the lab work, because they don't really work in isolation with each other.
And I know many of us find our way into medicine by way of our own health journeys and experiences, or by way of those who we love. We see them, having those experiences. So I can relate to that. And in terms of relatability, I think we all can relate to what a difficult period in time this has been, whether we're, in the US, in the UK, or anywhere in the world, truly. And so I wonder, what are some of the common themes you've seen during this pandemic period impacting how we eat, and subsequently how gut-brain health gets affected? Maybe Kimberly would like to speak to that first.
Sure. And I think I've seen, because the relationship between food and stress, food and mood, is so profound and so complex, I see a bit of a range, and kind of my work sits at the intersection of the two. So I guess on a broad level, what we saw across the nation was suddenly everybody obsessed with sourdough and baking and all of these sorts of things. And certainly what we know about the body's response to stress and what the pandemic did was to raise a kind of a sea level rise in our uncontrollable stress, which is the kind of stress that the body and the brain hates the most. We're fine with a stressor if we know that we've got a deadline and we've got the resources to be able to deal with it. But if it feels uncontrollable, that's when overwhelm sets in. And so what we know about the glucocorticoids, which are called glucocorticoids because of their response to glucose, is that carbohydrates turn off the stress response. They help the body's resolution from stress. So certainly my sense is that the reason we were reaching for a lot of nostalgic foods, but also a lot of carbohydrate-rich foods, was because there was an automatic kind of internal knowledge that this was helping us somehow deal with the stress. We also know that carbohydrate-rich foods, in comparison to protein-rich foods, help to increase the availability of serotonin in the brain. And sometimes, for some people, that can help them to feel better and to manage the stress. So there was that kind of, I think, for most people, quite normal kind of turning to comfort foods and comforting activities. And obviously, as a former competitive baker, I'm not going to tell people not to make bread. But on the, I think the slightly more difficult side is the people who are using food to try to create a sense of control. So if you can't tolerate the uncontrollable stressors of the pandemic, then often people who are particularly vulnerable to that will try to narrow the things that they can control. And food, we know, is one of the things that we can turn to control, whether you're counting calories or macros or the types of foods that you're eating. I think a lot of people, especially when we've been cut off from so many of our sources of support or our regular outlets for stress, have seen an increase or worsening in their relationships with food. And I think, we certainly know, for example, that referrals for eating disorders across the pandemic have increased. So there's been a shift across the board to the way that we relate to food. And I think there's going to be an awful lot of work to do as we come out of the pandemic to help people regain that sense of safety and equilibrium with their relationships with food.
Yeah, I think that's so important, to express that compassion and understanding for our need for comfort, for the absolute madness that can be felt in the midst of this profound uncertainty, something that we've never encountered like it before in our lives. And that, need for some iota of control, and how that can get channeled into, be it, worsening eating disorders, depression, anxiety, and so forth, addiction, otherwise. And so I think it's so important, that dichotomy that you brought up of both needing comfort and then feeling that chaos. And it, it really does make sense that you said about going to sourdoughs and other comfort foods and nourishing our mind and emotions in order to also thereby nourish the gut in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And things like activities like baking, and particularly things like sourdough, they take time, and a bunch of us had a lot more time all of a sudden. And it could, on the positive side, it acted as a distraction. You've got this little sourdough to keep going and to keep alive and to give you something to focus on. And I think for a lot of people, that was just a welcome distraction from the chaos around us.
Absolutely. Hazel, would you like to speak to, this subject of particular things we may be seeing more of in this pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking anecdotally from patients that I've seen, and also just people that I've spoken to, there seems to be this massive increase in kind of gut-related symptoms, be that typical of IBS, so a lot of bloating, a lot of changes in kind of toilet habits, so maybe diarrhea, constipation. And a lot of this seems to be stemmed from how we're living. So obviously stress is a huge component. And as Kimberly mentioned, there's a lot of that stress that we can't remove from our lives. It's there because of the experience that we're all living in. But also we're living in this kind of almost forced sedentary life. So we're not moving as much, which also means we're slowing down our bowel habits. When we're staying at home and we're changing our normal routines, it can also mess up our digestive habits. People are probably drinking a little bit more, drinking alcohol, which can also change our digestive system and how it works. And so there's various things that are happening. And we have our bodies are so sensitive and our guts are so sensitive. So, for example, when we go on holidays, we know that oftentimes people find that they get really constipated because they're in a new environment. Their bodies are very sensitive to that. And this is kind of what's happening, but on a larger scale. And so I know in my clinic, I'm seeing a lot of people with these symptoms. And again, a lot of them are, they're functional symptoms, which means we don't have a cause for them. We don't have a structural cause for these symptoms. And so it can be really easily passed off as it's just in your head, it's just anxiety, reduce your stress levels, and I'm sure things will resolve. But it's not always that easy. And so having these conversations and talking about ways people can manage them kind of on a first step basis, I think is really helpful.
Mm-hmm. I saw Raewyn nodding over there, so I wonder if you want to speak to this question too.
Well, I thought it was interesting that she brought up alcohol, because that's definitely something that I've seen more of. Generally, when we feel anxious, our GABA levels are depleted, and alcohol is one of those things that it's a sedating neurotransmitter. So that's what GABA is used for. It's helpful for helping us get to sleep. And usually when we're tense or stressed or anxious, we've got low levels of GABA, and alcohol can make us feel calmer. Because it mimics GABA. And a lot of people have been reaching more for alcohol. One, because they're probably at home and don't have haven't had a lot to do maybe at the start. And they thought, oh, we've got 2 weeks off. I think there was this sort of like, we're going to flatten the curve in 2 weeks. And everyone's like, oh, we got 2 weeks at home and they can just chill out. But then those weeks turned into months, and now it's a year. And it's actually a year today, right? I think since they announced it. So that's been interesting, seeing that, that the people's habits, they start off with like, oh, we'll just do this for a couple of weeks and then we'll go back to normal. But we've never gone back to normal. So some negative habits or behaviors have kind of proliferated throughout the year. And to Hazel's point, like, we aren't moving as much, and that definitely slows things down. So I've been seeing a lot more of those types of IBS, SIBO type symptoms, just sort of like oscillating between constipation and then diarrhea and the bloating and reflux, and also some other things too that people didn't think would necessarily connect necessarily to the gut brain, stuff around like migraines and skin issues and more eczema and more psoriasis, and these flare ups of stuff that is more functional than let's say structural. So seeing that has been interesting for me, and seeing how people have been trying to self-medicate. But it's important for us to kind of get a handle on that, and we can manage it through the things that we're eating and making sure that we are, consuming more vegetables and starting to balance out, the things that we've been doing that haven't been so great. So it's about creating that sense of balance and consuming more veggies and prebiotic and probiotic foods and less sugar, because the sugar thing was, Kimberly said that. She said everyone was baking more. And I'm like, yeah, the starchy carbohydrates convert into sugar in the body. So we've seen people reaching for that as well. Just kind of, and there's actually been an expression, the COVID-19 people who put on 19 pounds during COVID because they have eaten so much throughout that time. And it's like, because we've been sitting so much, we've been eating more and not moving enough, and probably eating foods that are very damaging. And alcohol is particularly damaging to the gut because it creates that leakiness. So it's not just what we eat, it's also how much we absorb. And, if we're damaging the lining of the gut by drinking too much, we're not absorbing the nutrients that we would get from foods.
So I hear all of you kind of touching on the gut-brain connection by way of identifying variables that are in fact biological that we might associate with being emotional or purely psychological, just by virtue of being drawn to certain foods when we're having a biological need, and vice versa. And certainly we want to nourish our bodies, we want to nourish our minds, and be compassionate for the outrageous flux that we're in. Just one last question, just from each of you, a quick takeaway, maybe first step to help people support their gut-brain wellness in this time.
So I think we've all touched on diet as a big thing, and I think it's something that all three of us have in common in terms of something that we're passionate about. And when it comes to eating for gut health, there's no one single best diet. But I think if we look at kind of all of the research that we have, and that's an area that's still very much in its infancy and growing, it seems to be a diet that's largely plant-focused, full of colorful fruits and vegetables, high in fiber, Mediterranean-style diet, and focusing on that as a first step, and not getting too bogged down by minutiae in terms of what supplements should I add in and things like that. I think that's a really great first step for people to focus on. And then if I can throw in a second one, I would say daily movement. And I think exercise is something a lot of people don't often relate to gut health, but it's really, really important for both brain and gut health. So it's something that I'm a huge advocate of, and there's no right or wrong way of exercising. And it doesn't have to be structured. It can just be going for walks. It can be yoga. There's any form of movement is good for me.
I will make an appeal to the nervous system, because the kind of nervous system state that you're in is going to have an effect on your ability to digest your food. So you have your sympathetic nervous system, or your fight and flight system, which is your body preparing for action, releasing sugars and fats into the body, moving blood into the extremities so that you can run or fight. And essentially, digestion shuts down. You don't need to be digesting food if you're running away from something. And on the flip side of that, we have the parasympathetic nervous system, or the rest and digest system, which is exactly what it says on the tin. You need to be in that physiological state to be able to digest your food. And so when I'm working with people who have kind of stress-sensitive gut symptoms, one of the things I always ask them to do is to take 2 minutes to do some very gentle, slow, long exhalation breathing before they eat, so that they can start to kind of use that breath to activate the vagus nerve, turn on the parasympathetic nervous system, and ready their nervous system, their digestive system, for the act of digestion. So take 2 minutes, gentle, and really focus on that long exhalation. So if you've ever done yoga, or you can look it up, is the Ujjayi breath with a very long exhale where you constrict the throat. Do that for 2 minutes, then eat, as Hazel said, your very kind of plant-based meal. And that will just, I think, help for the whole system to be working well together.
So I love that you just said that, because that's one of my favorite things to teach people to do. Like we do it in 4, 5, 7. So you breathe in for a count of 4, you hold for a count of 5, and exhale for a count of 7. And I generally encourage people to put their right hands on their heart so that they can tune into their bodies, and then their left hands on their belly, and that they breathe into that left hand and expand it like a ball. So thank you for bringing that up. And then my final tip would be rest. So, you were talking about reducing stress on the nervous system. Rest for success. That's what I think we should be doing more of. So getting into bed by 10 p.m. because that will help with melatonin production. And you want to get really good quality sleep, because that helps with regulating and healing digestion. It also helps improve memory and mood and metabolism, those 3 M's that I know a lot of people, they're trying to lose weight. Like, I'm exercising more, I'm eating less. Why am I not losing weight? Very often it can be that you're overtraining and you're not getting enough recovery or rest built in. So in the context of what we're talking about today, melatonin is so important in helping regulate and heal the body. It's a major antioxidant. So you want to produce as much of that as possible and not have it impacted by things like light. So from about 8 p.m., turn down your lights or turn off your lights. Get blue light blockers if you can. Get a red light or some orange light or amber light. Look at the sunset. These are also things that are very grounding as well, by the way, because they connect us back to the natural world. And all that has like a really big impact on that rest and digest state that Kimberly just mentioned. So rest for success. That's my top tip for improving gut health.
Excellent. Well, I thank you all for sharing your diverse wealth of information. And that's our talk for today.